set the stage here. We have, we have presidents increasingly using executive action to establish regulations because they can't get Congress to do what they do. We have Donald Trump saying if he gets elected, he's going to be a dictator. We have a Supreme Court that has kind of established an imperial presidency with some of its recent actions. The Chevron deference decision has been on some people's minds. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do very brief opening statements with our three panelists, and then we want to hear what you guys think about this and what you guys want to talk about. So we're going to start with Jeremy. So Jeremy, Amy, and Harvey, if you don't know them, look them up in the Kotok guide. Well, Jeremy, you're going to start. So what do we have to worry about here with regard to the rule of law, or any changes?
We said this could be like a 4-minute panel if we all say how quick, is there a real problem? But we each have different views on what we're going to focus on. I don't have a lot to say on the individual changes that maybe people are worried about. I'd say I'll give a macro level comment and then how we watch it in the markets. So I was definitely trained in the libertarian school of economics, sort of free markets, low taxes, individual choice, personal freedoms, all these kind of good libertarian school trainings. So that's definitely my politics out there. But if you think how is it impacting the markets, you would say if there's a disruption in the rule of law, one of the things the U.S. is known for is being the rule of law leader. If you say if there was really worry about this disruption, it would start coming in towards the valuations for the U.S. markets versus everywhere else. Well, what do you see in the U.S. market valuation versus its own history and versus everywhere else in the world? So the S&P, if you go 150 years back, the average PE was 15 for the markets. Today it's 22 times forward. So the trailing is worth 22 times forward. Our tech companies, 30 times earnings, and we've got the rule of law coming in. Should Google be broken up? Are they doing these antitrust things? And there's a lot of people think if you break up Google, its valuation is going to go up because the sum of the parts might be more than together. Take a country where there is a rule of law question. Let's just go straight to China. China had some of the biggest tech leaders around. You can't give away their tech stocks now. Talk about a rule of law issue. Some of these China tech stocks, Baidu, Baba, Tencent, all the big companies are now getting towards single-digit multiples. They're doing a few $1 billion of free cash flow, and they're not expensive stocks. But Trump was trying to go after China. China went after China, and now nobody knows if you can trust these stocks. It's reflected in the valuation. Nobody wants to own them. There's all the geopolitical concerns, but there's real rule of law questions there. I don't think we have that same rule of law issue here in the U.S. It's not at all reflected in the multiples. Now, there's a lot of individual policies that I'm sure generate a lot of buzz and a lot of focus that people will start talking about. But my macro level was the valuations don't say we have any concerns with rule of law.
So I have to disagree. Just to mix it up. So a long time ago, although David had already left his employer by that time, this would be David Burson, but in a galaxy far away, we worked for GSEs. I worked for Freddie and he worked for Fannie. And on that fateful day in September of 2008, the federal government seized Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. Prior to that, if one wants to do conspiracy theory, there was no mechanism in the charters for the companies to be liquidated or otherwise disbanded the way other private companies. They were created by Congress, Congress could take them out. So they did change the law in the middle of the year, and then things were a little rocky in the financial industry. You might have heard of some companies like Bear Stearns, a few companies. And there were rumors in the policy circles that were rocking the Freddie and Fannie boats. We get to September, and the CEOs were called into the Department of Treasury, and the CEOs were told to ask nicely for the bail. There was no choice, right? This was itself in a majority ownership position. So, rule of law, there were contracts. The federal government's action took out an entire financial instrument in one day. It still exists, but nobody's issuing any new. It's not really what it was. There used to be a very active market. This is no longer the instrument to use. So, those contracts, then, of course, now we're still in litigation over whether the conservatorship should be ended and who should be compensated and how that would be funded. There was a takings lawsuit because through the agreements that they made, first it was, we'll give you money and you got to pay it back at very high rates of interest, which caused them to borrow more money. But then they just said, you know what, forget it, just give us your profits. You don't have to pay the interest, you can just give us all your profits. That was finally adjudicated in last year, in August. So we still have these issues of the outstanding, like was the taking of the people who were in those positions and then the losses that they suffered, and a lot of them were banks, which caused a lot of bank failures. So I would argue that there is precedent for the U.S. government when they feel the time is necessary to make that, to take that action. It doesn't happen often, and we could argue about whether they thought that that was the necessary thing to rescue the financial system, and there's a lot going on. I won't say that there wasn't. But that would be one example where you can't really price that instrument.
So Amy, I'm going to ask you a question before you pass to Harvey. So that was a one-time thing. Is there do you have any concern that is do you see any evidence that that's a repetitive practice or anything to worry about going forward?
So that was, a unique time. We had a lot going on at that moment. But as another example, so we talked about the executive orders. So the Biden administration directed this was less than a year ago, directed the FHFA, the CFPB, to make changes in credit markets, consumer credit markets, to remove medical debt in collections from credit reports and directed all federally backed mortgage programs, including loan programs, so including the Small Business Administration, to take it out of their underwriting. The CFPB then used as justification to require the credit bureaus to remove that information from credit reports, that companies who have a market interest in the outcome have removed it from their underwriting, citing Freddie and Fannie Mae's actions. But they're owned by the federal government and were directed by their regulator to do so. So this is another example where they dictate the information you can and cannot use that was legal, that was part of this ecosystem to achieve an end, but it did nothing for the medical debt. Right? It still exists, it's just you're not supposed to use any credit. Except that last time you applied for a mortgage, you were asked about all your liabilities. So you as the borrower are required to report all material liabilities. If you don't report it, it's fraud, but we've taken it off the credit bureau so they can't validate it. Where's the fix? But this is another example, though, where they have put their thumb on the scale of a private market that didn't solve an externality or a market failure. This was simply we don't like medical debt because bad things happen to good people.
Yeah. So let's hear what Harvey has.
I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist, a rather cynical one, and a little too young to be as cynical as I am. There's a lot of people who want to think there is a rule of law and that we've had one, and my take on it is I'm not sure we've ever had one. We've got this imagined nostalgia for something that never was, and we keep talking about all this deterioration in the rule of law, but I don't see it that way. And I want to use as a prop, because we're here at Ames Lodge. This is a picture of one of my boyhood heroes, Ted Williams, and I've been admiring that picture ever since I started as good as it gets, but it's not hitting 1,000. And we want the law and our presidents and our political leaders to be hitting 1,000. It's an unfair comparison. You can get into the Baseball Hall of Fame these days with a batting average of .309. Okay, so we don't have that perfection. And we always have leaders who are driving, we're going to keep this rule of law going. But we always have leaders who are trying to undermine it. That's how they make their money. And in that sense, I think nothing has changed since the founding of the United States. And so let me go back to Ted Williams. He gave up 8 years of a fantastic career, 5 years in World War II and 3 years in Korea, and he volunteered to go fly more marine airplanes, which were the worst of the things you could possibly fly. And he would have had an even better career had he not done that. So that's the standard of perfection that we have to compare things against. And in that sense, I look at what goes on today, a little change here, a little change there, trying to undermine it. And I say, nothing has changed, and we're crying about problems that we are making up. We've got this nostalgia that we've created this artificial history that doesn't exist. And therefore, I think we ought to recognize there are always going to be changes in the law and the way we think about it, economically and all that. And as he said, we are still the leader in the world in terms of our financial markets, and it's not going to hell in a handbasket. So as bad as we may be relative to what we think we could have been, in theory, we want to aim for this ideal of a rule of law. But in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're very, very different, and we have to recognize that. So therefore, I think we are arguing over a problem that doesn't exist. End of talk.
Everybody was by. So Daniel, let me just ask two quick questions, then you can go first. I'm not only ask one actually. So Biden trying to dismiss all this student debt, and a lot of that is failing in court. Amy, you made me think of that when you talked about another type of executive action. Is that a problem for financial markets, or is it the opposite, which is that it's all getting adjudicated, and where it can't be done, it can't be done?
So the latter. And so student debt, most of it is owned by the federal government. And a lot of these programs were created, so the federal government had a failed policy of driving people towards college, and they couldn't really create more spaces in the normal college places. So what happened was for-profit universities sprang up everywhere like mushrooms after rainstorm. And you know that some of them have been judged to be fraudulent, like ITT Technical Institute, Corinthian Colleges. Yes. And so some of that is a way to remedy the fact that people took on debt for a fraudulent product. And when the Obama administration went after Corinthian College, and I can't remember their sister organization, they then left office, but before they settled how that would happen. So if it's fraud, like if somebody takes out a credit card name in your name and you didn't apply for it, that fraud gets removed from your credit report. It's not that it was paid as agreed. It never happened. But they didn't create a way in the education department to make that go away. So you had to apply for every loan. The Trump administration sort of wasn't interested in solving that problem and made it very difficult for that. We had programs for teachers and so on. If you were in public service, that debt would get forgiven after a certain amount of time. We made it virtually impossible for people to live up to that. We didn't hold servicers to standards. So some of what the Biden administration is doing is trying to fix policies that were already in place and make them actionable. Other parts of that, and so the announcements are often those kinds of things. But it's also, we lied to people about the benefits of college and who was eligible to go and should go. And so I think some of that is fixing a wrong that was there for a while as well. And when we say college, we didn't mean plumber school, right? We didn't mean trade schools. We meant go college and become an artist or a philosopher, a scientist. So on that level, I think that they're probably on the right path, and where it helps capital markets is that people who are burdened by this debt get that monkey off their back. They become better credit risks otherwise and better able to contribute, start businesses and so on. So I see that actually as a benefit because it's not like they're erasing credit card debt, right? And who knows what they'll do with medical debt.
Wasn't part of the privatization part of the Affordable Care Act? Wasn't that so the budget worked out for the Affordable Care Act with the privatization because we were going to make money off student loans? Or am I misremembering that completely?
I don't remember student loans being part of it.
I thought that was all part of the pay for of Affordable Care Act. Okay, I apologize.
I'm just going to add one quick thing to that. This is a good teaser to the MMT discussion tomorrow with Sam and Jim about just more debt, more printing, more spending. This is part of the MMT story in some ways, but you could question the policy of should we have done it and all the rest. I fully agree with Amy that we've been pushing too many people to school, and we had Pat Harker who was my dean at Wharton when I was there, and he's Philly Fed president, has been one of the big persons. And as for Dean of Wharton, Delaware is also saying too many people go to college and more people need to go to plumber school and be apprentices and not spend all this money on something that they're not going to get value from. So hopefully education does change. So big statement on that, but this is definitely an MMT discussion.
So, Amy, wearing your NACM hat, given the backdrop that we have today, as a practitioner, somebody who's parsing out credit or not, how do you, given the current backdrop, how do you best do your job as somebody who does or does not grant credit to entities?
So I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean,
If you're a grant manager and you're trying to determine in this environment when there is forgiveness and not forgiveness, when there's fraud, when there's not fraud, I read you very closely every month.
yeah.
And your commentary is a little bit harsher than what the data is actually saying. Right?
So, National Association for Credit Management is the Accounts Receivable Trade Association. So think of it as B2B credit, and in the context of if you're a manufacturer, you ship out chainsaws, then Home Depot you send an invoice to Home Depot, and Home Depot has to pay you back. Or it could be the local Ace Hardware or whoever, and you have to make decisions about how much you're going to grant to those folks or not in terms of sales. And this could be services, it could be manufacturing, all those things. And the question is whether, how do you go after somebody who didn't pay you? Like, what is your recourse in
But also,
the
how
marketplace?
do you determine how much credit they should or should not have to begin with?
So that goes back to what I think America does best of anyone, which is credit reporting. It's a voluntary system, but it is the most in-depth data, the broadest data, and with the most guardrails on it that create a system of very inexpensive, very efficient capital allocation to consumers and businesses. There's a trade report version of the consumer credit report, several versions actually. And so because of that, because I can look at how you paid your bills in the past and how much total indebtedness you have, I can make a judgment about whether you are a good credit risk. And it's based on trust. Ultimately, it comes down to trust. And I have limited capital as a lender. I can't say yes to everyone. There's an incredible amount of energy spent on fraud mitigation. If you could turn the people who are committing the fraud into actual positive financial people, imagine where the world would be. But that to me is one of the strongest pieces of our credit system is credit reporting. And it's entirely built on trust. And when this is another piece of where I think some of the executive order regulatory actions come into play, or Congress, they start meddling. So part of the pandemic relief was we're not going to report delinquencies to the credit bureaus.
that we might have more expertise in the audience on that. So if Dave is out there, he had some thoughts on this. Dave. Nodding.
He's playing poker.
Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Jeremy, you're
I don't know about the,
I think we're going to take a pass on Chevron doctrine because we just don't have the expertise up here. But obviously, that's a good topic for another time. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, loan forgiveness is not loan elimination. Debt is not debt elimination. The debt gets shifted. Is it appropriate to shift the debt to people who didn't want to take it out, didn't know they were taking it out, as opposed to the people who did take it out?
So,
And do you mean the tax?
Often it would be taxpayer.
so it's the student loan debt is the only debt you can't discharge in bankruptcy. All the other debts, your auto loan, I realize there's foreclosure, but still, credit card debt can get discharged in bankruptcy.
Let's talk about student loan debt.
Right. So that's the only one that can't. To the extent that the debt forgiveness is about enforcement of policies for service, like being a teacher in a rural area or whatever the program might be, then I think it's actually upholding the contract that was made, which was you serve, which is a gift to taxpayers, right, because you're providing community service. To the extent that it's because of fraud, then it's a mistake from the government that they accredited institutions that should not have been accredited. That's another big chunk of what's being forgiven. The rest of it, then, you have to ask, what was the benefit to trying to enforce the unenforceable? People are not paying on these debts. They can't afford these debts. They are being less productive. They're being unable to open businesses and other things that they might otherwise be able to do. How did they get into it? Again, I think that it is not a great policy to do, but I understand where they're coming from on it and the relief that they're trying to provide to especially low-income families. But what's the cost benefit? I don't know that we did that. That's probably the better question.
Let me ask this question. What about the moral hazard? When you forgive that debt, and then you get into all the moral hazards of when people enter into a contract to pay money. And so, what's your view of the balancing off of that?
So I agree, and that's part of what makes me not like some. So again, when it's enforcing a policy that was announced prior, like serving as a teacher sort of thing, I think that's reasonable. And where there's fraud, was deemed to be fraud, that's fine. The moral hazard is a very big piece of that, but then you have to ask, well, you had to go to school for it in the first place. They're not forgiving all the debt. They're not forgiving the debt of the people who graduated necessarily, right? A lot of it is debts $10,000 and less. I don't know what policy problem they're trying to solve when they do that. Was it all people who went to for-profit universities, in which case are they going to fix the accreditation? So there's no easy answer from my perspective on that, but I think it's many misguided policies have got us to this path. But you could ask the same thing of why did they bail out Silicon Valley Bank? Isn't that a moral hazard?
Yes. They bailed out the depositors.
Pardon?
They bailed out the depositors.
Right, but the depositors are the market mechanism by which the bank was supposed to be disciplined.
Thank you.
Okay. But having said that, where do you keep your payroll? What bank do you keep your payroll? So we only have 5 banks. That doesn't really make sense. And what's to keep JP Morgan from doing something stupid?
They could put it in money market funds, and then they don't pay it forward. The bank has to change. Like you could
hand survey. Should the government have let depositors burn on Silicon Valley Bank? In other words, just bailed them up to the. So if you think the government should have allowed that, put your hand up. Yeah. The question is, should the government have bailed out depositors only up to the FDIC limit and no higher than that? In other words, so that's about 60%.
Most of whom worked at bailed up banks. From just raising the point.
Okay, so let's go to Jim Hall over here. You had a question, and we're going to. So then it's going to go Jim, Kendall, and then Constance.
So I'm going to switch things on rule of law a little bit. You guys know I'm new energy. So one of the big changes, we used to, when we did cross-border pipelines, they were a ministerial action. We always approved them. We used them for tracking flow of goods. But what changed was during Obama, not thinking this is just historical, was Keystone. So that changed rule of law on pipelines. And that really precipitated some of the challenges. I mean, we've always had challenges on infrastructure, but interesting thoughts on, how do we get back into really improving infrastructure, which is critical for our country, in rule of law, and not making those. That was a political decision on Keystone that had nothing to do with rule of law.
And by the way, improving infrastructure is important to green energy too.
Exactly.
It's not just
It tries to power transmission. It's
all, yes.
more important than pipelines.
So does anybody
But
have any thoughts on that?
we really impacted that system.
Anybody?
Politicians have been doing this since time immemorial, where they're talking about. So what's new here? What is truly different? And that's where I keep coming from. And you can talk about the bailouts and the Federal Reserve and the FDIC bailing out every depositor in during the financial crisis. Yeah, there's moral hazard there, but there's nothing in the Federal Reserve Act that says to the Fed, thou shalt not commit moral hazard. Okay? That's their job. That's why the Fed was created, to be a lender of last resort in very uncertain circumstances. That's why we have central banks. So I'm tired of this moral hazard argument. As Paul McCulley told me in a canoe here in 2008, moral hazard is the price we pay for living in a civilized society. I've been practicing moral hazard in my own family since I had children. That's what we do. That's part of our system of ethics. Okay? I don't let my neighbor starve when he's out of work, and we're looking for this ideal thing. Yes, let's keep pursuing the ideal in a world where there's no moral hazard, but you can't get there from here or anywhere else. Sometimes it's just necessary in order to have survival of our economy and our society. End of speech. Mic drop. And that's not official Federal Reserve. It should be.
Kind of is.
So I want to make a comment about banks. Bill, going back to the previous thing, maybe you guys can react to it. Banks serves two purposes. One is credit intermediation purpose, handing out loans. And we have decided that is best done with a couple of thousand banks across the country, so that each lender is close to each individual business, as opposed to a bunch of banks in New York City with thousands of branches. And I think that's a reasonable argument. The other function of a bank is the warehouse where we put our money. And as a fractional banking system, it's always inherently unstable for us to put our money into a fractional bank. Now, there's an answer to that, a fully reserved bank. And we already have that. It's called a money market fund. But in 1974, the Fed officially came out against the creation of a money market fund, because what they were worried about was eventually everybody would say, you know what, I want my direct deposit, I want all of my wealth to go into a money market fund, which is fully reserved, and I want to keep it away from a fractional bank.
many trillions and trillions are sitting in banks earning nothing when you can get 5% in the money market today. It is embarrassing the status quo bias to keep the money earning nothing when the new technology is going to let you write checks off of the money market fund. It's been there for a long time, and you can do even more and more of that. So it goes to the question, where should the lending come from? But I actually 100% amen to Jim. Agree fully, they should be getting money market funds 5%. It's embarrassing what the banks are doing.
Okay, anybody else?
Let me add something. If we go back far enough in history, we realize that banks were created to help governments finance wars. And they still exist for that purpose, okay? And they're required to have liquidity and treasury bills and all the things. And the king chartering a bank, the quid pro quo, simply, I will charter your bank, I'll give you an exclusive monopoly in this county in England, but when I fight a war, it's your job to finance it, so I can pay the soldiers, because we don't pay the soldiers, they walk off the job. And that's the history of this thing. And we lose sight of this circularity, and I'm sorry, but banks today are required to finance an awful lot of things that they wouldn't do on their own, but that's the cost of having a charter given by the government.
Like
and
what?
you can't enter the banking business
Like
without
what? What do they finance today? Like what?
the U.S. Marines is one example.
Now, can
Do
you
they
explain-
finance it?
Can you explain what you mean by that? What you're saying, I'm just trying to understand. That's all.
Okay.
I'm not being critical, I just want to understand when you talk about financing the U.S. Marines, exactly what you mean by that.
The number one thing that people want from their country's government is to provide security from invasion. That's costly. Banks were created to help do that financing and still do today. And when the government threatens to shut down, the thing that gets the elected officials to finally act is because they know if they don't pay the soldiers, we are vulnerable to being taken over by, you name your favorite enemy. And I think we lose sight of this circularity and the role that banks were created to play in this. So
Let's you know what, there are many topics we can pick up later, we got a lot of hands, so I do want to rotate. Kendall, you and Constance. So,
You named me already.
so if you like, I'd like to have
So, I was just gonna say, when those folks who raised their hands, and I was one of them who said, yes, we should let Silicon Valley Bank fail, I realized that we all have the luxury of saying that because we didn't have knock-on effects, because we didn't have a bunch of other banks that failed. And at the time that they were making this decision, of course, they thought that there was perhaps an unraveling of many, many more banks. I mean, let's look at Bank of America's balance sheet and the unfunded liabilities, or like the losses and treasuries that they haven't realized. So I think it's all, I mean, even though I raise my hand as I reflect on it, we sit here from the luxury of hindsight in 2020 to be able to say, they shouldn't have done that, right? But we really don't have the counterfactual.
Did anyone in this room
Is there-
250 or so the body bank? No. One.
Tom, say that again.
Did anyone in this room have above the limit at Silicon Valley?
One person.
Two. Which way did you guys vote?
No, why do you ask that?
Okay, Constance, so you had your say, but you think I didn't detect a question in there. Okay, good. It's all good. Kendall, you're up.
So I'm gonna summarize some of Harvey's earlier comments in regard to assembly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. That's kind of where we are. So
you're crazy if you think it was great before, right? That ultimately things come and go, and you have both political and regulatory regimes that change over time. That's the constant. Is it better or is it worse? You know, I keep going back to McCarthy kind of sucked when he was doing his thing. So I kind of, you know, we've recovered from that.
Kevin or Joe?
Must have been Joe. Yeah. But you know, so we recovered from that, and that was a pretty devastating use of power. But yet we recovered from that pretty well. So I'm not saying it's great, but
Okay, moderator's privilege. I'm going to interject. Brando, do we have an answer from your wife? You haven't looked? You're not. I just
I think, to the business of banking, where the banks are taking the treasuries and owning them. It could be the depositors owning them directly in a money market fund, like Jim's saying, and then it does question who's going to do the role of traditional lending. Okay, that's a real question. But the banks don't need to be the buyers of the treasury. The depositors could own them directly in some kind of fund.
So, Harvey, I would ask you the question, how do you regulate the banks when this is the superseding factor? How do you regulate the banks as a bank regulator?
How do I, not sure I understand the question, Daniel. Can you paraphrase it? Dumb it down for me.
If you're concerned about the fact that you can't, as a regulator, forge a marriage between two banks because one doesn't want to buy a bride without a dowry.
Okay.
Okay? So then how do you properly determine the risk of a bank's loan book? Because you can't even get past whether or not a marriage can be brokered in this environment.
And other banks cannot look at another bank's balance sheet and figure it out too.
Well, if you're FDIC, you can't be the marriage broker. It's hard.
These marriage brokers. Okay.
You're allowed to say you're not sure. You're allowed to say you're not sure.
I am not sure, number one, but I'm trying to think of a answer because the government is intimately involved in every bank's activity. The fact that the government charter that gives them a conflict of interest, the fact that the government has to pick up the pieces when the peanut butter hits the fan gives them a conflict of interest. And I don't know how you deal with this. And let me just add one little thing. When I was going around after the financial crisis and giving speeches around the country, not in Texas, I wouldn't say this, but I would say, howdy, my name's Harvey Rosenblum, I'm from Texas. I've been a libertarian all of my adult life, with one exception. When it comes to the banking industry, I am not a libertarian. Because of the networked aspect of the banking industry, you cannot be totally hands-off as we would like to be. And again, that's the perfection, the ideal we would like to have, but you can't do it in banking. And more, as time has gone on, we have other industries that are networked that we have to depend on so much, and the government has to get involved, and they have no better solution than the private market, but they have to get involved because the market can't solve these problems out there. And I think of some of these antitrust cases and all that. I think of this phone I have where I'm dealing with a quasi monopoly. Governments are getting involved, even though I don't want them to. But when everything is as networked as it is, the whole system breaks down if it can't function.
All right, so I've got a terrifying thug